Hello, I'm Santosh Pai, an Indian cross-border lawyer working within the India-China corridor since 2010. I've recently written a paper titled India-China Economic Ties, Determinants and Possibilities, which was published by Carnegie India. And in this video, I'm trying to summarize some of my findings for viewers who have not had a chance to read through my paper. So the paper's overarching objective is to analyze the determinants that drive India-China economic ties and also to examine the impact of global events, bilateral political ties, and domestic policies on them. To facilitate my analysis, I've divided the landscape into four components, namely trade, investment, which includes foreign direct investment and foreign portfolio investments, public procurement, which includes import of goods for consumption by the public sector in India, and also EPC contracts by Chinese contractors in India. And lastly, Chinese participation in the Indian digital economy. The big question, so to speak, which my paper addresses is what are the lessons we can learn from the last 20 years to formulate policy responses in the future to achieve India's national objectives, and while doing so, to strike a balance between economic and national security imperatives. So, now moving on to the paper, the first section titled Laying the Foundation covers the origin of the development of India China economic ties. The starting point for this is the 2005 Political Parameters Agreement, where a decision was taken to keep the boundary issues separate and prevent them from derailing economic ties. By 2005, China was already India's number two trading partner with bilateral trade at $17 billion, with a modest 4.1 billion surplus in favor of China. The period 2005 to 2014 saw accelerated growth in trade. In 2008, China became India's largest trading partner when bilateral trade touched $30 billion. Soon afterwards, in 2010, both the governments set a target of $100 billion for bilateral trade. Throughout the next decade, as trade grew, we saw significant dips in India's trade deficit only on three occasions. Namely, they were all global events, namely the 2008 financial crisis, the launch of the US China trade war in 2017-18, and of course, the COVID pandemic. Rest of the time, the growth in trade and the deficit was driven by fundamentals, which were the growth in China's manufacturing capacity and the consumption demand in India. Now we turn to investments. Between 2014, which is when investments first came into the mix of India-China bilateral economic ties, between 2014 and 2020, this was accompanied by the launch of the Make in India program and the abolition of the Foreign Investment Promotion Board to scrutinize investments. Chinese investments flowed with minimal scrutiny into India. Although, relatively speaking, the total direct Chinese investments in India during this period was barely $2 billion. But one must also point out here that indirect investment flows were of a much larger quantum. And due to difficulties in accessing reliable sources, indirect investments are not analyzed in my paper. Now, the only sticking point with investment flows was that India's objective of attracting investments in the manufacturing sector were not able to be realized, since an outsized quantum of flows in the form of venture capital investments were directed towards the Indian startup ecosystem, where most of the businesses were participants in the digital economy. For example, between 2015 and 2019 alone, approximately $3.2 billion in the form of solo investments and an additional $5.6 billion by way of joint investments flowed into approximately 57 startups in India. The third piece of the economic puzzle between India and China is public procurement. This represents both import of capital goods and also the EPC contracts, which I mentioned earlier. These continued more or less constantly continued to grow between 2010 and 2020. Now, the next section in my paper deals with the responses India formulated after the Galwan Valley incidents in May of 2020. And these comprised primarily of three broad responses. The first one was the imposition of FDI screening mechanisms for investments originating in countries which share a land border with India, which is popularly known as Press Note 3. The Press Note 3 mechanism subjected investment flows, regardless of whether they were directly flowing from China or from other third country jurisdictions, as long as they had beneficial ownership vested with an individual or an entity registered in China, they were made subject to approvals by the Indian government. Now, this Press Note 3 almost instantaneously applied brakes on investment flows. For about a year after imposition of Press Note 3, there were no approvals forthcoming. So we can say that the policy response, insofar as it looked to stem the flow of investments, was extremely effective. The second broad policy response that India adopted after the Galwan Valley incidents were a registration requirement for participation by Chinese companies in public procurement contracts. This extended from mere supply of goods to larger EPC contracts, whether by public sector undertakings, government ministries, and so on. Even the state governments were following this registration requirement since 2020. The third response India had was a ban on internet applications originating or operated by Chinese companies. In total, there were about more than 200 internet applications which were banned in a successive series of executive orders issued by the Government of India under the Information Technology Act. These internet applications were banned on grounds of national security, contending that the integrity of the data collected from Indian consumers was at stake. Now, when one looks at the impact of these policy measures, it was varied. For instance, there was almost no impact on trade. In fact, after COVID, India's trade deficit with China has grown faster and today is in excess of $100 billion. Investment flows, on the other hand, completely dried up, including the indirect investments into the internet digital economy. And public procurement was a mixed bag. I say mixed bag because India continued to import goods from China to fulfill public procurement. But at the same time, Chinese companies were subjected to a registration requirement. And when there was no registration forthcoming, were prevented from directly participating in public procurement contracts in India. Now, having examined the impact of these measures, 5 years after Galwan Valley incidents, there has been a thaw in political ties. October 2024 saw that the political tensions had eased and an opportunity has now presented itself to re-examine or recalibrate our economic ties with China. Now, while doing so, India has multiple objectives to achieve. Firstly, is to reduce our trade dependency and to stem the growth of our trade deficit with China. Second, is to expand India's manufacturing sector by taking advantage of the China Plus One strategy, which is focused on diversifying investments into the manufacturing sector away from China, while at all times ensuring India's national security with a large neighbor with whom we share a disputed border is not compromised in any way. So We need to now learn to live with this paradox of rivalry and interdependence. What can be the way forward? One thought I leave with you is that India must actively examine measures taken by many other countries who share the same dilemma, which is having a large dependency on China for imports, while at the same time insulating their economy and developing a semblance of economic security or self sufficiency, so to speak, in certain critical sectors. And some of lessons can also be learned by China's own policy measures. In the last 20, 30 years, China has been extremely successful in attracting FDI flows. And now China is looking to consolidate its economic strengths and impose controls on exports of technology and even goods to a large extent, and manpower, as was recently witnessed with India. So I hope you all get a chance to read my paper. The full paper is available in the link in the description below.